when you get to the final speaking question, the structure probably won't be very surprising because this is very similar to other speaking questions, especially task 4. This is an integrated question with just a listening before you speak. So first you listen to a lecture, and then you summarize the lecture. You talk about what you heard. The first part of your answer will be the big ideas from the lecture, the concepts. Now, these are always at the start of the lecture, so your answer is sort of similar to the lecture in structure. In the lecture, he will or she will define and then explain. And you will do the same thing. You will define first and then you will explain. Now, this is generally a definition of two ideas. Sometimes it's one, but it's usually in pairs, and it's very similar to the text in task 3, this beginning part. So these two related concepts are similar to, in my other video, you saw an example of two concepts that were defined in a text. Here, it's just that they're defined at the start of the lecture. And they will contrast or compare in some way via examples. But in the beginning, you're just going to show the relationship between the two concepts generally. So here's an example. At the start, the professor defines, he calls them inbound and outbound marketing. Both types are ways that businesses get new customers. But whereas outbound marketing includes things like advertisements, inbound marketing includes like articles and information. That is, inbound marketing is material for people to find, when they want help. Okay, that was a long introduction because it was a complicated set of ideas. That's okay, as long as I have enough time to give these concrete examples of the concept afterward. So part 2 is going to be the first concept, an example of the first concept. Now, if we think about inbound and outbound marketing as the two concepts, then my first example is going to be about one of those two. So in order to get there, I should transition to an example. Say something that shows I'm going to give an example next. So she explains by, he provides a couple of examples, she illustrates by, she shows how this exists in the real world by talking about. Okay, there are many ways that you can phrase this, but the point is that you're going to transition to concrete examples from the general definition. Relate the first example to the first concept. So, in this case, my first example is outbound marketing. So here, this is a explanation of an example of outbound marketing. The professor illustrates the difference with a website, a site that sells shoes. He gives the example of a billboard advertisement as outbound marketing. The customer doesn't try to find it, and maybe they don't want it. It comes out of the company and interrupts the life of the customer. Sorry about that. There should be an S here. Comes. Okay. So this response now, this part of my response, is the detail, the example that relates to the first concept from my introduction in part 1, from my definition in part 1. Part 3 is the same thing again, except I need to compare it or contrast it with the first concept. So that's how I introduce part 3. I compare that to, or contrast that to, In the same way, similarly, on the other hand, there are many ways you could do this, but you need to show the comparison or contrast with the first detail, the first example. That was part 2. After you show that comparison or contrast, then you give some concrete details, some specifics that the professor mentioned in the lecture. So here's an example. This one will be about inbound marketing. Then the professor explains how the same company could rate different brands of shoes on their site, and people might search for those ratings and find the site. The big idea is that both inbound and outbound marketing bring people to the website, but inbound customers are they're being helped by the marketing. Okay, notice this contrast, this comparison here. I am making a connection between the two parts of the professor's lecture. I am making a connection between those two examples. This helps to define, helps to clarify what was in the beginning of my response, that first part. So these concrete examples of rating different brands of shoes compared to the billboard, they help show the difference between outbound and inbound marketing. So to recap, first, define the concepts generally. Next, explain the first concept and give that concrete example. And then connect to that a contrast or a comparison with the second concept and compare it to the first concept. And that helps to explain the definition that you gave in step 1.